Hello, welcome everybody. We are just getting some back-end technical things squared away, so we will be with you in just a minute, so bear with us, please. In the meantime, you know where to find your handouts and you know to ask questions in the question box. Let's see. If you're not able to stay on for the whole time, don't worry, we're going to record today's class. And provided everything works out well, you will have a recording to watch later on. And let's see what else. I'm Pamela. You know me by now. I'm a East-West graduate, and I used to teach at school. Oh, and I think I hear Christopher.
We don't see or hear you.
Well, what am I supposed to do next here? Let's see.
Put up your webcam.
Yeah, that's already up. But based on, here's the control panel. At first I didn't see the control panel. I got it now.
Okay.
I'm going to make you the presenter now, Christopher, okay?
I'm hanging up.
Okay.
Okay, you should be getting the accept and share my screen message.
Yes, I see it.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Yes. I like your cool glasses.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, so, it makes me look more professional, right?
Yep.
So you can hear me okay? Can you see my screen?
Yes, I see the one that we saw first go round last time, the desktop.
All right, I have to change show screen, screen 2. Now you can see my other screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. I think we're good then, and you can hear me okay?
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
Quick note for everybody, if you get an error regarding the handouts for today, you can refer to the email that Jill sent with the handout that was attached in the email. And if you still can't get the handout or can't find it, just email Jill and she'll send it along to you. That should take care of those questions in advance. And I guess without further ado, I will let Christopher take the reins.
Okay. What you'll see is this is the universal ancestor down here, and then you get these splitting events, these speciation events, or breaking off of lineages and creating new lineages. And so you have the eubacteria, which are pretty basic, archaebacteria, protista, the plant kingdom, and then fungi and animals. Well, it turns out previously fungi were placed in the plant kingdom, which is wrong. And it turns out that fungi is more closely related to animals than it is to plants. So just some interesting tidbit for you there. And there's an estimated 5 million species of fungi on planet Earth. We haven't even begun to really identify all the different species that are out there. And recently, I don't know whether I have this in my next slide. No, I guess not. Recently, a new study where they did incredibly deep core sampling, they found that fungi were likely around and had arisen around 1 billion years ago. So fungi have been around for a long time, and they arose here. And so animals and fungi have a long history of coevolution. Don't forget that pathogens, there are some fungal pathogens, Alternaria, and of course Candida. Don't forget also that yeasts are one-celled fungi. So yeasts, we use yeast to make food, We culture them to produce drugs. They have all kinds of uses. Yeasts are very important to us and very useful. And so are fungi. And don't forget that penicillium, where penicillin came from, and many soil organisms produce life-saving antibiotics like penicillin, streptomycin, and so forth. So mushrooms are, besides mushrooms as medicine, and we're going to focus mainly on visionary mushrooms as medicine, but I want to say that mushrooms are also very important and have incredible potential as a healing health food as well. The popularity of mushrooms as food and medicine, excuse me, is very, very widespread in Asia and has been going for a long time in Asia, but now just beginning in Europe and North America more. In Europe, there's chaga, and there are a few other mushrooms which were used by the ancients, but not too many. Mostly wood ear and chaga were really two of the ones, and quinine conch. These are three that were used in Western medicine, Western cultures as medicine, but certainly a lot more in Asian cultures. And in North America, mushroom extracts, many different types of mushroom extracts are sold without the need of approval or a registration, you might say, like they are in Canada or some other countries like Germany. So there are a lot of different products out there, and it's kind of wild in some ways. Some of the products are really, really high quality and really good products. Other products are not quite as high quality, and there are some identification problems. There's some substitution problems, perhaps, and there's a problem with a lot excessive starch in some products. So we have some problems, but there are some very, very good products out there as well. The most popular medicinal mushrooms are shiitake, maitake, reishi, cordyceps, turkey tails, lion's mane, chaga, and Agaricus blazei, and perhaps a few others. And what the products that you see out there, a lot of times you can find tinctures, you can find double extractions. In Asia, they produce all kinds of interesting products with fungi. In this country, a lot of the products are powdered products. So you either get, typically the mushrooms are cultivated, the mycelium is cultivated, and remember mycelium is a really beneficial part of mushrooms. And then you also have the fruiting body, which is when the mycelium mass together and produce a structure in order to produce spores. So that's the main job of the fruiting body, is to produce spores and to reproduce, spread the spores far and wide. But the mycelium is also very, very useful. And as long as it's pure mycelium or mycelium that is cultivated on some kind of substrate, I prefer organically grown, domestically grown is great. And there's a high percentage of mycelium, then the product can be quite good. And fairly, I think both fruiting body and mycelium are fairly comparable as long as there contains a lot of mycelium or a lot of fruiting bodies and not a lot of maltodextrin or starch or other types of substances that aren't really very active. And they're also, and I mentioned so these powders have to be cooked or steamed, heated up to a high temperature to release the main active ingredient for immunoactive effects, and those are beta-glucans. So the beta-glucans are part of the cell walls of mushrooms. All mushrooms and yeast contain fungal beta-glucans, which are highly immunologically active and really affect a lot of, have really amazing effects on our immune system. But we're going to go on to, I think I have another slide here. Recently, people have created action groups to legalize psilocybin mushrooms for medicine. So I want to get psilocybin in here. That's going to be the focus of this talk. And psilocybin mushrooms are showing great promise for healing and supporting people with psychiatric ailments like depression and anxiety, existential angst from critical diseases, serious ailments like cancer and so forth, and addictions and many other things. So we're going to delve into that in this talk. But I want to finish up with this slide, which has a few more health benefits of eating more mushrooms in general, like eating more shiitake and stir fries. I stay away from the button mushrooms pretty much. They're okay, but they're just don't have as much beta glucan in them, so they're not quite as immunologically active as other species like Grifola, which is maitake, and even pleurotus, which is oyster mushrooms, and of course shiitake. So those are three to eat really, which I focus on, that are edible and delicious and can be added to soups and stews and our dishes. Now don't forget that mushrooms are, I forgot, didn't turn this one's got this automatic slide advance on, so that'll keep me moving along here. Otherwise, I'll have to take time. On the break, I'll take time and change the setting. So don't forget that mushrooms, besides being high in fiber, which is very important in our diet, and if you eat 65 grams of fiber a day, or 50 or 60 along in there, the average American gets around 25. But if you eat up to 50 grams of fiber per day, you're like 1/3 to 1/2 less likely to have a chronic ailment like cancer or heart disease. Well, especially heart disease. I don't know about cancer. That's not clear, but heart disease, yes. You're much more likely to keep your heart system, your cardiovascular system healthy and functioning well if you increase your fiber. And mushrooms are one of the highest fiber food of any food. So that's a really big case for, it's the #1 killer in most developed countries is heart disease. And with more fiber, we can really counteract that to a great extent. So you want to add more fiber, more mushrooms to our diet. And besides, they're delicious. They're very high in B vitamins. They have a high and valuable trace mineral content of zinc and copper, and there's a lot of potassium and phosphorus in them. Mushrooms are just a storehouse of nutrition along with the fiber. And so I recommend organically grown medicinal mushroom powders. I work closely with Mushroom Harvest in Washington. Those are US grown and organic, so I am going to recommend them for good quality mushroom powders. So let's go on to magic mushrooms or psilocybin mushrooms. Here is a slide that you might find interesting. This is one of the mushroom gatherings that I went to years ago, where someone brought in some psilocybin mushrooms, which are right here. You see these little brown mushrooms. Those are psilocybe cyanescens or azurescens, I guess these are. One of the most potent of all kinds. And someone also, by the same token, the same year of our fungus fair in Santa Cruz, which I teach every year, brought in a pink gelatin brain. And on the pink gelatin brain, some penicillium fungi started to grow and created these spots on here. So I couldn't help it. We had this psilocybin in a case up front. So I typed up this, this is psilocybe, and this is your brain on psilocybe. Any questions? So I just thought it was just strange and appropriate that it came out like that. Is this, okay, this is, so let's go on to Michael Pollan's new book, How to Change Your Mind. And it's a good read. I recommend reading it. He talks about the ingestion of hallucinogens in general for health, or just as it allows the time to see one's plight on planet Earth here and see our symptoms, our diseases subjectively, and realize that we don't have to identify with them. That's one of the benefits of using hallucinogenic mushrooms such as psilocybin. They temporarily dissolve the sometimes tyrannical or trickster ego so that we can be free of it for a short time. It's not controlling our lives, our head telling us, lies basically, and how our thoughts go off in our head about and can get quite negative sometimes and worry extensively. Don't forget that in Chinese medicine, too much thinking and worry harm the spleen system, the digestion, and that's where our energy comes from. And it's also closely tied with our immune system. So when we're thinking a lot, worrying and so forth, we can't get out of our head. We're listening to that little voice in our head that's telling us how bad things are. That is harm. That's not only making us crazy, but it's harming our digestive power and our energy, and it's also harming our feelings of equanimity and our immune system, our immune response. So we don't want that to happen for month after month after year or whatever. Now and then we go through these things, but hopefully we can let them go and find our equanimity. Well, psilocybin and other hallucinogens can help us find equanimity and even peace with serious illness, intractable symptoms, intractable pain, addictions, and also they help us connect with a sense of oneness of spirit. Feel a sense of awe and feel profound feelings of connectedness, a lack of separateness, loneliness, and isolation. And it turns out with psilocybin mushrooms, we're more likely to have a profound experience, a healing experience, and life-changing experience when we have a very, very deep spiritual experience with the hallucinogen. So there's microdosing, and I'm going to talk about microdosing or taking small doses of hallucinogens and psilocybin, and there's also just moderate dosing, which has its own benefits or can have its own benefits, but it's really the higher doses that tend to really lead to life-changing experiences and permanent experiences and changes for the better in our life, and research shows that, and I'll get into that in a bit. A guide is always good to have on a psilocybin journey, especially with higher doses. And it's interesting that guided psilocybin journeys and LSD journeys have been conducted by experienced guides since the 1960s. Many, many studies were actually conducted in the 1960s and early 1970s on psilocybin, LSD, and so forth for addiction and for depression and anxiety and so forth. And before it was all shut down in the late 1970s. And so there are more published studies than meets the eye. There were a lot of studies. However, these early studies were not as conclusive because the methodology was sometimes not very high or not very high quality. So now we've started new studies now that the licenses have been restored for conducting research with psilocybin. Here's my classic reading list for hallucinogenic mushrooms and substances in general, natural substances. First of all, Soma by Gordon Wasson and Valentina Pavlovna Wasson, his wife, who wrote a number of books on the historical and cultural uses of mushrooms for healing, for visionary purposes, spiritual purposes, and they're just wonderful, wonderful books. They were groundbreaking books. Soma talks about, here's the cover of Soma. Gordon Wasson writes about Soma is the ancient Soma, which the Rig are mentioned in the Rig Vedas to be a very spiritual part or very integral part of their spiritual practices. that had amazing effects. That his theory or his argument is that soma was actually Amanita muscaria, which now has been pretty much refuted, and I'll talk about that later. Mushrooms, Russia and History by the same authors. Hallucinogenic Mushrooms of North America, Ott and Bigwood. Psilocybin Mushrooms of the World, Paul Stamets wrote that. How to Change Your Mind, Michael Pollan, I mentioned that. Sacred Mushroom Visions by Ralph Metzner, a very interesting read. Of course, the very, very classic Food of the Gods by Terence McKenna, who didn't just stick to psilocybin mushrooms, but was a great kind of an explorer of those hallucinogenic journeys, and writer and speaker. And also one of the most classic books of all, Plants of the Gods by Richard Schultes, arguably the world's most renowned ethnobotanist, and also Albert Hoffman, who was the one who isolated psilocybin and psilocin from hallucinogenic mushrooms, and also the discoverer of LSD, and then Christian Rech. So you may know by now that Denver voted to decriminalize psilocybin to make it a low priority in Denver, and then after that, Oakland follows suit, and now now Santa Cruz. So we have 3 cities that I know of anyway who have basically deprioritized hallucinogenic mushrooms completely, and that's the first step towards legalization for medical uses, which is a lot of people are on that path to use the same models that we did with cannabis to try to have psilocybin mushrooms become legal for medical uses. And now the research is really building up, so that's the interesting part. So psilocybe, the genus psilocybe, is the main genus that has psilocybin and psilocin, which are alkaloids that bind to serotonin receptors and other receptors in our body, and have a very profound effect on our mind and psyche and nervous system. But psilocybe isn't the only genus that has these alkaloids, psilocybin and psilocin. There's also Stropharia, the genus Stropharia. Not all species, some species. Stropharia tends to be fairly safe as a mushroom. Gymnopolis, purpuratus, and other species of Gymnopolis. Here's Gymnopolis right here. This is called the Big Laughing Gym because of Gymnopolis. And laughing because it contains psilocybin. However, unfortunately, Gymnopolis does grow in clusters like you're seeing here at the base of trees in the western United States and also the eastern United States. Unfortunately, the ones that grow in the western United States do not contain psilocybin. The ones that grow on the East Coast do contain psilocybin, and they apparently are used back there. Paneolus is fairly rare. You're not going to find too many of this particular species, which does have psilocybin. Most Paneolus species do not. They aren't particularly dangerous, most of them. Now, when I'm talking about using mushrooms for, picking wild mushrooms, I always get the caveat in there that don't forget that a few wild mushrooms are lethal, like amanitas. Remember, we have a saying, don't eat an amanita. So some amanitas like Phalloides and Ocreata are very, very toxic and even lethal. So make sure you know what you're picking, and go on some walks with a educated and experienced guide. Get some other guides and just get out there and start looking at wild mushrooms if you're not familiar with them, and use a number of characters to identify the mushroom, to genus anyway, and maybe species. So Paniolus is not one of the more dangerous ones, or is Gymnopolis or Stropharia. Not that there can't be some toxic species in these, there could be, so don't forget that. But when you get down into these other ones, Canosabe, Inosabe, these two have some very toxic species in them that contain muscarinic acid, which is very toxic. So don't ever pick, you might read that Canosabe cyanopus has psilocybin in it. I wouldn't try it, don't even go there. And Inosabe, some species are confirmed to have psilocybin in them, but it's not worth it because many other Inosabes are very difficult to differentiate from the ones that have psilocybin in them, and it's not worth really trying. So make sure you know what these look like because these can actually grow next to psilocybin out in the field in some bark or whatever, in some grass. And so you want to know basically what these two genera look like and avoid them completely. Luteus, Salicinus, that's European, so we don't really have it over here. Now here's a chart that shows the content of psilocybin and psilocin in some psilocybin mushrooms, different species. You can see that in this chart, psilocybe azurescens is the highest, is the mushroom that has the highest content of psilocybin, 1.78%, and 0.38% psilocin. Now these two alkaloids kind of, psilocin can transform into psilocybin, so they're both active, but one's more active than the other. But so we can either say it's just all psilocybin. Some of them hardly contain any psilocin, as you can see down here. Whereas one like cubensis has an equal amount of psilocybin and psilocin. So they're both active though. So azurescens has almost 2% alkaloids in it. That is a lot of alkaloids. So these are extremely potent azurescens. By the way, azurescens can actually be cultivated fairly easily on bark chips and might actually fruit. You could find a fruiting of them. Here's some other ones. Bohemica semilanceata is the one that we always picked on the Oregon coast that grows in cow pastures. It grows on rotting sedge and grass where there is dung or cow manure in the area. It doesn't actually grow on the cow patties, but it does grow it likes the extra nitrogen, but it actually is growing on rotting grass and sedge and so forth. This is very high and is a very strong species. Baeocystis is known to be strong. And now here's cyanescens. Now, Psilocybe cyanensis is a very common one in the West Coast, other places. It's considered a very potent species. And I actually found 2 or 3 patches of them in my area over the last several years. So they are around. They're mainly found in bark chips that are next to grass. So on the border between grass and bark chips, you can see them growing. Cubensis is the most widely cultivated one because they're big and meaty and easy to grow. Mexicana is down in Mexico. Sunsia you don't see too often. And there are some other ones, and here is Canosabe and Pluteus and so forth. You can see that the Pluteus salicinus has a 1%, which is quite a bit. And some Inosabe has 0.4%, but again, don't bother with those. Those are just too problematic. So what is the dose? What's the standard dose of psilocybin considered? The median oral dose for people is about 7 milligrams, which means about 1 gram dried or 10 grams fresh of cubensis, and less for more potent species. You can use the chart, and you can use this chart back here, and you can kind of determine if you have azurescence or cyanescence or cubensis. You can kind of determine by weighing the dried mushroom to find out approximately how much psilocybin and psilocin you are going to get. Remember that the amount of alkaloids varies considerably with the population and with the species. So there are no guarantees out there if you're eating mushrooms what kind of experience you might have, unless you're very familiar with a particular species or you cultivate them or whatever. So and that brings up a point that I might mention here. I made a extract. I wonder if I have it here. I think I have it here. Let me see. No, I don't have it right here. I made a liquid extract that I put in a bottle like this with a spray, and I'll tell you how to do it later, how to make them. But the best way to do it is to standardize your dose. If you're using it for therapeutics or you're microdosing, is really to get, if you happen to find a batch of psilocybin mushrooms or you're growing them, remember that it's going to vary from population to population, even from mushroom to mushroom, and definitely from species to species. So gather your mushrooms, wash them, clean them, dry them, powder them, and blend them all up together. That way you have, and then freeze them down. Remember that psilocybin and psilocin can degrade over time when they're exposed to heat or light. So you want to keep them frozen down, whether they're fresh or freshly dried, you still keep them frozen down, and it can keep the potency for up to 1 or 2, 3 years or even more. Then you can make a tincture out of it, and then you have a standardized dose, so that and then you can try 1 squirt or 2 squirts or 3 squirts, and that way you're kind of discovering how potent it is before you just take a whole handful of mushrooms that you have no idea how potent they're going to be, and that they might vary from dose to dose. So mix them all up and then tincture them is one good way to preserve them and to dose them. They don't taste that good either. They're a little bit gritty, and I don't mind them, but I think the taste is, and the texture is not that great. The recommended maximum dose under most circumstances is about 150 milligrams of psilocybin alkaloid, and that means psilocybin and psilocin. And that would be less than 10 grams of the dried mushroom. That's a lot of mushroom. So that's going to be considered a very high dose. The alkaloids have a structural similarity to serotonin, and that's how they act. They bind to their agonists for serotonin receptor sites, among other things. So it sticks around your body for a while, interestingly. It's detectable in the blood after 7 days. So it's going to go down really quickly. The typical amount of time that you're really going to feel it strongly is about 6 hours, maybe a little bit more, a little bit less, but you can still detect the alkaloid in your blood after 7 days. Better quality, it's just best if you can grow your own or find a source that, get the whole mushroom so you know what you're getting. Here are the known physiological effects of psilocybin. Many people, in clinical trials, people are measuring, some of the trials, they measure the body temperature, the blood pressure, the heart rate, pupil dilation, and other physiological parameters. Those are monitored so that they know when you take a dose that you're likely to experience some of these effects, such as increased body temperature, pupil dilation, hair erection for a short time, showing a sympathetic effect. So it does have a sympathetic effect. That's why it increases your blood pressure a little bit, your body temperature, hair erection. It's a sympathomimetic, in other words. It's going to hit your sympathetic nervous system. Pleasant mood. In many cases, people feel a pleasant mood or euphoria. Some cases, apprehension. Many people feel apprehensive or even can panic when they first start taking it. And if the dose is very high and you're not used to it, definitely anxiety and worry and even panic has been reported especially from people who don't take it very often or haven't taken it much in a high dose. Spontaneous laughter, muscle weakness, which is interesting because that kind of belies a sympathomimetic effect. Drowsiness sometimes. At first, higher doses, spontaneous colored visions, and a dreamlike state. If apprehension is present, recovery is typically from 2 to 6 hours. You might be over that actually within 30 minutes. And that's why a guide is always recommended. I'm going to recommend having a guide a number of times during the talk, especially if you have a pre-existing condition and you're using mushrooms for therapy. It's much better to have a guide, an experienced guide if possible, but at least a friend who can help you. It has a very low acute or chronic toxicity, like genotoxicity, teratotoxicity, very low apparently. And one thing you might be interested in is that there was a clinical trial performed, I think I mentioned the trial later, that showed that it had the lowest dependence potential of any recreational drug, including tobacco or alcohol or, of course, cocaine or heroin and so forth. So it has the possibility of addiction to or dependence from psilocybin mushroom, even if you're taking it regularly, is very, very low. And very few actual published case studies show psychological injury, and maybe with people who already have pre-existing psychotic episodes or something like that, but it's very rare. Let's talk about the history of psilocybin use. Here are some of the mushroom stones that have been found. The Incans and Aztecs used psilocybin mushrooms and Mayans. Over 400 religious mushroom stones have been found in Mayan excavations. And we think that the consumption of hallucinogenic mushrooms in ritual ceremony may be about 3,500 years old. And here are the references if you want to look them up. It was widely used throughout Mesoamerica cultures, including southern Mexico. And there are some writings from 500 Common Era that shows fungal use. And the first written reports that we have are from the 1500s, from monks first that traveled to the New World and met some Mayans, and then later Spanish soldiers who were also historians came in the 16th century and detailed the use of psilocybin mushrooms. Interestingly, psilocybin mushrooms were often eaten with honey along with chocolate. And that makes total sense to me. I mean, chocolate has its own psychogenic activity, especially if you get really strong stuff like one I showed you earlier, but also for the flavor. So you might consider, if you ever find yourself in the position of eating mushrooms, you might consider taking it with a really beautiful dark chocolate eaten with honey. And if you live in Santa Cruz or Oakland or Denver, it won't be a legal problem. And visionary mushrooms, the flesh, this means the flesh of God. Teo Nana Kato. And they were eaten for their prophetic visions. Priests used them, but also warriors and healers. So many psilocybin mushrooms were used in many facets of their culture, not only for healing and obtaining visions to divine the illness of the patient, but also just for general spiritual purposes, as a priest might do, but also for warriors and healers of all kinds. Now, I want to mention Schultes and Albert Hoffman. Here's Albert Hoffman here, kind of a fanciful picture of him indicating his famous bike ride where he intentionally took the first dose of LSD after accidentally absorbing it through his skin and rode his bicycle home. And so this is the celebration of Albert Hoffman riding home on his bicycle. And this is Gordon Wasson here, and showing he really brought the knowledge, the first knowledge of how psilocybin mushrooms were used for healing and ceremony from southern Mexico. And that's stamps are celebrating him there. And here is Richard Schultes, who was really the first person to find a psilocybin and many other hallucinogens, and traveled through the Amazon for many, many years, had malaria quite a few times. His body was just beaten up by the time he finally left the Amazon and went back to Harvard. His body was really beaten up. He spent so many years in the jungle studying the hallucinogenic and visionary properties of plants. Here's some history here. We don't have to go into that, but the bottom line is the true scope and identity of the shamanistic use of psilocybin for many centuries, perhaps millennia, was finally uncovered by Gordon and Valentina Wasson. And the first trip down to visit Maria Sabina was in 1952. And here's Gordon Wasson and Valentina Wasson. Valentina was a Russian MD and was just crazy about mushrooms. And when she met Gordon Wasson, who was a banker, interestingly enough, he excited his interest in mushrooms and fungi. And together they wrote quite a few books and had quite a few explorations all over the place, and wrote about their journeys and adventures together. So that was a really good marriage there of interests and abilities. And this is the hut where Gordon Wasson first went down and experienced the psilocybin mushroom in ceremony with Maria Sabina. This is Maria Sabina in ritual. And here she is burning copal. And here is Gordon Wasson receiving the psilocybin mushrooms from Maria Sabina, the sacrament. And here he is eating it for the first time. The photographer, where you might be seeing here, the photographer promised his wife that he wouldn't eat the psilocybin mushroom, but he broke his promise and ate them anyway for the first time. The second time, he didn't eat them. He wanted to record everything. He was the photographer. Here is Maria Sabina with one of her sons. Here is Maria Sabina with her oldest son, who is apprenticing to her, and where he's under the influence of the visions. Maria Sabina sang beautiful songs. She was also a poet and a singer, and her songs are just incredible. And you can find her praying and chanting and her writings online. And she says things like, or sings things like, I take little one who spring forth, I see God, I I see him sprout from the earth. He grows and grows, big as a tree, as a mountain. His face is placid, beautiful, serene as in the temples, and so forth. I'm not going to read all of them, but she has. And by the way, you can. There's really is a site. I cited in my book that you can go, and they have a lot of her songs that you can listen to online, and they really are truly beautiful songs. So look for that. You can just type in Maria Sabina and Velada, Velada. So her Velada is her songs and chants. So here's a summary of this study by Amsterdam 2005 that showed that basically psilocybe was legal in Amsterdam. You might know that. And so you could go to Amsterdam and you could just go, and in fact, I did this. My friend Bob and I went to Amsterdam in about 1990, I think. And we went into shops, and you would say psilocybin mushroom, and they'd pull out drawers, literally like this, sliding drawers. And in there, they had all these different types of magic mushrooms that you could buy and try. And you can eat them on the spot if you wanted to. So we were pretty amazed at that. So they performed this study in Amsterdam and in 2005, and what they found was that here are the common side effects: temporary mild to moderate increase in heart rate and breathing rate, anxiety, dizziness, and nausea. About 25 or a little bit over % of users, especially with higher doses over 15 milligrams of psilocybin. They noted that concomitant alcohol use, as well as other drugs, increased the risk of side effects. And again, they found that the harm potential was very, very low for psilocybin, and they're considered soft drugs. Toxicity low to moderate, public health impacts, criminal aspects negligible. So this was a 2005 study, 15 years ago. So here are the contraindications, or where supervision is recommended. If you have pre-existing psychological imbalances, if you have pre-existing medical conditions with the use of pharmaceutical drugs, concomitant use of pharmaceutical drugs for depression, anxiety, psychosis, bipolar, suicidal thoughts, and so forth. So if you have any of those ailments, comorbidities, whatever, and you're thinking about using psilocybin, or if it's being used by a practitioner, then it's always imperative to have a guide and to understand that it could have some cross effects. Pre-existing heart conditions, because it does raise your blood pressure and your heart rate. So if you have a mild heart cardiovascular problem, again, maybe talk to your physician, and also have a guide. But if you have serious cardiovascular issues and you're on medications, then you really have to be careful. Concomitant use of alcohol, MAO inhibitors, which aren't used as much nowadays, but maybe they're still around. But heavy alcohol use or even moderate alcohol use, you have to be extra careful. Now, here's one theme that you'll always hear about any type of hallucinogen, and that is the set and the setting is very important. So set basically meaning mindset. So how are you feeling coming into the experience? Are you feeling anxious or depressed, or are you agitated? Do you have pre-existing issues, psychological issues? So the set is very important to determine the type of experience you might have. And the setting, of course, where you will, what your setting is. Is it going to be at a party, at a rave, or is it going to be in the forest? I never thought of psilocybin as a recreational drug I know that in talking with my son, young people today do think of it as a party drug, but I never have looked at it that way. I look at it as a sacred medicine, and I want to be out in the woods. I want to be where my allies are all around me, or I would be fine in a room that has soft lighting and beautiful paintings, for instance, or and some music that I love and a guide. That would be fine, but otherwise I would want to be out in the forest and in a wild place. That's where I feel most comfortable. And okay, so set and setting is very important. The use is not recommended in stressful settings. Again, so if you're in a city with lots of people around, or in a house even with a lot of people where there could be interpersonal conflicts and so forth, that is not the place to be taking it, in my opinion. Driving and operating machinery, not recommended as well. I could tell you stories about that, but I think I'll skip that for now. The bottom line being, I don't recommend it. Okay, here, let's get into some science. Science reviews of the effects. Over 1,000 clinical papers have been published on classic psychedelics in general, and that's a lot. That's a lot of papers, with collectively involving approximately 40,000 patients between 1950 and the mid 1960s. And here's the review right here, Grinspoon, 1981, if you want to read about some of those older studies, many of which were not very well controlled or designed. Some of them were very ad hoc and very casual in their methodologies. The most compelling evidence supported of these older studies, the most compelling evidence supported benefits for end-of-life existential pain in cancer patients and for addiction. So a lot of studies were done with LSD and psilocybin, tobacco addiction, alcoholics, and so forth, and definitely people with existential pain for cancer patients or other patients. So after these studies were really had become active, I mean, Gordon Wasson brought basically the news of the psilocybin mushrooms that were used by Maria Sabina for healing purposes, for shamanistic purposes, in he went down there in 52, I think, or 50, I think I said 52 for the first time. And the Life magazine article was published a couple of years later, and really brought the news to the Western world, if you will, and had the full photographic spread and in the writings of Gordon Wasson about his experiences, and that really opened everything up. And then, of course, there is Albert Hofmann and his LSD discovery. So this really brought on kind of a counterculture craze in the 1960s, mid 1960s, really through the 1970s, and then a media circus really took place with this strong interest by the media and by young people like myself, hippies and so forth, really went crazy over it. Then came Timothy Leary, who was telling people to drop out, tune in, or drop and tune in and drop out and so forth. And this made it even crazier for a lot of regulators and straight medical researchers. They weren't really enjoying that type of media and hearing about that. So then in the late 1970s, all the research licenses were pulled, and it basically got shut down after about 1977, I think it is. And yet practitioners of psilocybin and LSD therapy did remain underground, and they have been practicing ever since. That is made clear in Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. He kind of documents that. Here's some other studies. This Johnson and Griffiths study here, 2017, shows or talks about that psilocybin was administered along with structured psychotherapy, counseling, and talking support, and so forth. In fact, there are some more recent studies that show that the benefits from psilocybin mushroom work even better when a guide is there and when someone, when a trained counselor is there that can feed back, help you discover the meaning of your experiences, and really just help you be a listener as well. So here are some therapeutic benefits in clinical studies. Here's the alkaloid here, psilocybin. So depression and anxiety, this is was the dose, 0.2 milligrams per kilogram, which is about 15 milligrams for a 154-pound individual. That's considered a fairly high dose, not the highest by any means. More recently, 51 people were in this trial, Johnson et al. 2016, and they used a high dose versus a low dose psilocybin in a double-blind placebo-controlled study. After 5 weeks and after 6 months follow-up, the high dose regime resulted in numerous improved clinical outcomes in 80% of the patients. And the amazing part is complete remission in 60% of the patients with mood disorders subsequent to cancer diagnosis. And that is astounding. Basically, to summarize a lot of the scientific findings that are coming out, and I detail every single study in my book. I give the outcomes and study design in brief in my book on all the clinical trials that have been performed on psilocybin by category. And we're not going to be able to cover them all here, but just representative studies. But it was really these kinds of figures and these kinds of successes are just unheard of for psychiatric disorders like depression, anxiety, and other obsessive compulsive disorder and so forth. So this is what really piqued a lot of researchers' interest. The early studies is what really piqued the interest in researchers and got them, and then the licenses were started to be redistributed again after 2011. And then we have these studies, 2016, Ross, where they used 0.3 milligrams per kilograms versus active placebo. And in a number of studies, instead of a placebo that had no effect, they used niacin as a placebo, because when you take niacin, you feel a tingly sensation and you feel something. So they give people niacin versus the psilocybin. And in this study, Ross 2016, they found they got similar beneficial results in about over half the people, and even up to 80% with no major side effects. Here are the studies on some studies. More studies have been done than I'm presenting here. There's a small open label study with 12 people, 10 milligrams oral first session, 25 milligrams second session. Every individual participant showed a reduction in depression severity at 1 week that was sustained in the majority of people for 3 months. 5 of 12 were in remission at the final 3-month follow-up. Psilocybin did not cause any unexpected or serious adverse events. This is Carhart-Harris et al. 2016. Now, Carhart-Harris is a very, very active psilocybin researcher and has written a number of articles. If you want to read more of about his studies, just go on to Scholar or PubMed, either one, and type in Carhart Harris psilocybin, and his studies will come up. And I think there's another study after this one even, and quite interesting. Psilocybin for smoking cessation. Sorry for the graphic. Here's an open label study, 15 people with a 6-month follow-up. They were given either a moderate dose, 20 milligrams per 70 kilograms of body weight, or a high dose, 30 milligrams per 70 kilograms of body weight. They were given doses, and within a structured 15-week smoking cessation treatment protocol, so they got counseling as well and support. Turns out that 12 of the 15 participants, 80%, showed 7-day point prevalence abstinence at 6-month follow-up. So after 6 months, 12 of the 15 were still smoking free. They were still abstinent after 6-month follow-up. And this, with standard treatments, the best rates are 35% success. So 80% versus 35. I mean, this is not really unheard of, and that's why more and more studies are on the books. Now, you can go to, if you want to see what clinical trials, if you're curious and you want to see what clinical trials are ongoing right now with psilocybin, you can go to government.clinicaltrials.gov or just clinicaltrials.gov, and you can type in psilocybin, and you can see that there are quite a few psilocybin studies ongoing right now that have been designed, that have been started. They've already gotten the participants, and they're ongoing. And there's some really big studies going on now, and that will, once those results come out, which will probably be 2 or 3 years from now, that is going to be a game changer probably, if they're getting really strong success like these smaller trials have shown. Okay, this is only just a sampling of the science behind some of the clinical trials. Again, I go in great depth over, I'm going to show you here some of what's in my book, cancer-related anxiety and depression. There have been a number of studies showing beneficial effects. Major depressive disorder, there have been 2 studies. Addiction, treatment, and recovery. There's alcohol dependence, open label with tobacco addiction. I talked about that already. Here's another open label pilot study, 15 smoking volunteers. So there's another one. All of these had some positive benefits. For spiritual life purpose, people that are having ennui or are feeling lost in life or whatever. So there are a couple of studies there. Cluster headaches, there is one study that showed some benefits. And one of the more interesting aspects of psilocybin that I didn't mention before is that it's showing that psilocybin can lead to increased neurogenesis, the growth of new nerve cells, which is pretty darn interesting. Lion's mane also has shown similar benefits, but to find out that psilocybin does as well, talks about or supports the idea of microdosing perhaps for extended periods of time. There isn't much on this though. This isn't really a clinical trial. This is in vitro, in vivo studies. So let's go on to microdosing, and then let's see, we started at 2. Did we start at 2?
We started a little bit after. Would you like to take a couple of questions before moving on and a little bit of a break?
I think so. Yeah, I'm going to draw a breath here. I've been going straight. So yeah, let's have some questions.
Okay. A couple of people were asking if you could, let me just pull out the whole If you could provide the book list again, which we can do at the end of the class. Someone asked if you
Okay.
should freeze your psilocybin mushrooms.
Yes. If you're going to keep, you don't have to freeze them if you're going to use them fresh or freshly dried. But if you're going to store them for any more than a few days, I would, whether it's fresh or dried, I would recommend freezing them.
Okay, thank you. So with regards to the benefits, is the response after just one dose or after a few / series of doses?
It varies. Sometimes people have a life-changing experience after one high dose or two. That's possible. Some people really do need a series of treatments. And so some of the clinical trials, most of the clinical trials, I would say, would have maybe 2 sessions. But some clinical trials only have 1 session and follow-ups. But I think that many times, 2 sessions may be needed, especially for very intractable conditions like intractable depression, severe intractable depression. Then 2 or 3 sessions might be required, but not typically. Well, the clinical trials so far have not been, hasn't included more than say 2 sessions or at most 3 sessions, I don't think. But for long-term use, that remains to be seen, whether how many people are going to respond to long-term use, like maybe 5 or 10 sessions versus 1 or 2 sessions. So we still don't have much clinical data on extended sessions and more sessions. One interesting fact is, I don't know whether you ever read about Cary Grant. This isn't on psilocybin, but it was LSD. He had, he was very, very, hopefully everybody knows who Cary Grant was. It's a different generation, of course, but he was a very famous movie actor that starred in many films and was, a very good-looking man. At least many people thought he was. And he suffered from very, very intractable, what's the word, where he was so stuck on himself. He had such a feeling of superiority and separated himself from people, and that caused him a lot of grief and suffering over the years. He literally had, I can't remember the exact number though, but he took multiple sessions of LSD, and I think it was like, it blew me away when I read how many sessions he had, but he literally had over 100 sessions, or maybe 200 sessions of psilocybin over a number of years, and it finally did cure him of this feeling of separateness, and that he was, better looking than anybody on the planet, and it gave him a very, I read his story, and he said he gave him a feeling of warmthness to everyone, and it really was, changed his entire life. So this is an example where someone needed multiple sessions of LSD, which is arguably even more potent than psilocybin, before he received really a major change in his syndrome. So I think we have yet to see whether long-term use and how that's going to work. And if people take 1 dose or 2 doses in sessions and it really helps their depression, are they going to have to keep going with it? There is an indication that they will. I actually saw a video on a person who had PTSD and very, very severe, and had 2 sessions and then had to keep going and take other sessions. It wasn't really a clinical trial, but it was like one person's case study. And he said that it worked for maybe months, but then eventually the symptoms would come back, so he would take another session, and it seemed to keep working. In other words, it didn't stop working, but just that he had to keep taking it every several months. So there's a lot we don't know about that yet.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question is, why are these this category of mushrooms affected by citrus?
Citrus. The only thing citrus would do is, an alkaloid is weakly basic. An alkaloid is weakly basic. So if you have berberine, for instance, berberine is an alkaloid. It's a yellow colored alkaloid found in golden seal and barberry and Oregon grapefruit and so forth, coptis. Well, it isn't very well absorbed. Berberine has very poor absorption from the gut. However, when you make a salt out of it by reacting it with very weak hydrochloric acid or sulfuric acid, then you get berberine hydrochloride or berberine sulfate. And those are much, much better absorbed. Those have much higher absorption rates. And that's why when you take tablets for cholesterol or blood sugar regulation, which berberine can help with, and other things, you use it in the sulfate form. I usually have a vial of it right here. I don't have it here. I'll bring it. Anyway, berberine sulfate is Wang Lian Su, and that's a really good way to take it because it is a salt. And that's the same idea as psilocybin and psilocin. Those are alkaloids, which are weakly basic. And when you take it with citrus, which is going to be, citric acid and ascorbic acid, then it's going to create a salt, possibly. It's going to react with it, and you're going to get better absorption. So I think that's what the issue is. Though, I don't know. I haven't, none of the clinical trials have used that method so far, but I have heard about it. But that's the mechanism.
All right, thank you very much. And then I guess we'll do one more question and then take our break. This last question is, so if psilocybin is supposed to help depression, is it recommended that people wean off antidepressants before they take it? It was on the contraindication list. People who are on those meds shouldn't take the mushrooms.
Yes, I think it's a good idea generally. And of course, again, you want to have a guide. I think that maybe one of the or two of the studies, people had been recently taking antidepressives, and maybe in one case they were still taking antidepressives. I think it's better to stop, yes. And again, have a guide, because that just adds another level of uncertainty about what's going to happen. And don't forget that antidepressants like SSRIs are going to interact with the serotonin circuitry. So when you're taking an alkaloid that also affects that, there's no guarantee what might happen. They might have synergistic effects in some way. I wouldn't recommend it, basically, and I don't think many. I'm not really recalling right now whether one of the studies or two of the studies people were taking it, but I don't think so. So bottom line is, I think it is definitely much better to stop and to be under the care of a psychiatrist or physician before stopping and doing your session.
Okay, thank you, Chris. I actually have a follow-up question from the single versus few doses question. The student says, would you say that the reason someone has to take mushrooms multiple times, say every few months, might be due to lack of integration? The student thinks that perhaps the lack of integration might be because they're not doing any work outside of the mushroom sessions, things such as therapy, meditation, or other modalities pre and post sessions. Can you comment on that?
Well, I agree with that. Some of the research has shown that psilocybin works even better and synergistically with counseling and a guide there that is going to feed back and listen to your experiences and fears and what you've gained and so forth, and also be a positive amplifier for that. So counseling and guides are really probably going to be in almost every case more effective than just doing the psilocybin on your own. I'm not saying it couldn't be effective on your own, but I think that what the participant is saying is true, that if you take psilocybin and then you just go back to your normal life and you don't have any counseling, you're not trying to work on yourself in any way, reading spiritual things, meditating or whatever you're doing, I think that yes, you would need, it's more likely that you would need follow-up sessions because you're using psilocybin then more like a drug and less like a holistic treatment that includes counseling, of course, diet and other herbs as well, and exercise and yoga and everything. It's always better in a full-on treatment. I think as herbalists, we know that all of our herbs, all of our treatments are, it's just assumed that it's going to be within the framework of a complete program for health. And so I totally agree with that. Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think those are all the relevant questions for now, so we can take our break. Do you want to do 10 minutes, 5 minutes? It's up to you.
We can do like 8-10 minutes, something like that.
Okay. See everybody. We'll see you all. We'll start in 10 minutes from now.
Good
So wherever
idea.
you are, it'll be 35, after the hour.
Okay, good.
Great. See you in 10 minutes.
All right.
Hey everyone, it's Pamela again. I just wanted to remind you that the handout link may be broken for some of you, and if it is, check your email. What did Leslie had posted in the chat for everybody? So the slides for the webinars today are not available, but you do have the handouts. The handouts were emailed to you by Jill, so check your email. If you are convinced that you did not get your handouts in your email, which does happen because spam filters and volumes of emails and things like that, just shoot Jill an email and she can resend the handouts to you. Let's see, if there's any other pressing issues, just get in touch in the questions box. Otherwise, I'll just remute myself and wait for the man in charge. Hello, Christopher, I muted you. I'm going to unmute you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I can hear you.
Okay, good. Are we going?
We're ready whenever you are.
Okay, I'm ready. Okay, microdosing. I just microdosed some fresh squeezed OJ. Man, is it good. Watered down a little bit with water. We have a local orange grower here, which is very nice. Kind of refreshing. So microdosing is unlike, using a really high dose, is the idea that you take just a little small dose and over a longer period of time, and even to the point where you don't really feel it much, and you just notice maybe some mild effects, and you're certainly not going to be hallucinating. So it's a dose that's much below that, and people are doing it with ketamine, with LSD, and psilocybin, probably other drugs as well. But definitely LSD is considered a productivity hack in Silicon Valley, using psilocybin or LSD to kind of open up your mind to new ideas and get, I don't know, kind of be a disruptor in your life in a way, so that you start thinking in a new way, increasing your creativity and so forth. So here's a case study of a person, Dennis van der Meijen, or however you pronounce it, Myden or Mygen. And this was reported on Reddit. And by the way, you can read lots and lots of case studies on Reddit. If you want to go on Reddit and type in psilocybin microdosing, you can read all kinds of people's experiences and what they're feeling and what benefits they're getting out of it, side effects and so forth. So here's an example of a person who is a Dutch graphic designer, producer, and rapper. And he takes twice weekly microdoses of psilocybin, and he says that it sharpens all his senses and makes him slightly more conscious. And he doesn't exceed 0.4 grams because 0.5 made him a bit too joyful and a bit too philosophical. Huh. And so other psilocybin microdosers, and again, there are many, many on Reddit, report that mushrooms can increase creativity, calm anxiety, decrease the need for caffeine, and reduce depression. So it's a really interesting idea. One that I practiced, and this is way back when, but when I lived in Oregon, near the Oregon coast, we could drive over there and literally the cow fields sometimes would have hundreds of psilocybin mushrooms coming up in them. So I had lots of experience with microdosing and took it frequently for 9 months at a time, even daily. And it was pretty amazing. I can't really give you an exact account of how it changed me, or I mean, I might have been the way I am now anyway. I don't know. But overall, it seemed very positive. I didn't have any side effects really, besides mild euphoria, terrible side effect, and lots of energy, but it did seem to reduce. I had a touch of shyness when I was young, not so much now, but when I was young, I had a touch of shyness, and it would come out once in a while when I was speaking to very large audiences. And one time someone mentioned it, came up to me and afterward and said, that was a great presentation, but I noticed that you have a little shyness. And so that was after all those years literally of using psilocybin on and off, microdosing, I think I lost all that. So I think I really, looking back, I think it really did have some really positive effects overall. And I can't think of any negative effects that it really had, except I didn't feel like working a whole lot. I just wanted to hang out in the woods and look at flowers and mushrooms. So that could, if you want to call that a side effect. Anyway, microdosing seems to be quite interesting, and some people call it a productivity hack. So let's look at the genus psilocybin a little bit, psilocybe a little bit closer. Here's a really clear image of a couple of psilocybin mushrooms I found in a patch of bark chips near where I live. And like I said, had grass growing nearby as well. And how do you identify psilocybin when you go out in the field and you wanted to pick some psilocybin? How would you identify it for sure? Well, one thing I can tell you is that I don't know if I have, I guess not. The one caveat is to make sure to not just use one character. So in other words, you're seeing some bluing reaction here and here and here. You're seeing that there is a bluing reaction, and that's one of the most, and maybe even up here along the edge of the cap and here, you're seeing some bluing reaction. Well, bluing reaction is definitely one of the primary characteristics of psilocybin. However, don't just take one characteristic. Try to get as many as you possibly can. Another one is that they're going to be growing in bark or decomposing bark or grass, sometimes with dung around. They're small, medium saprophytic fungi, saprophytic meaning that they're feeding on decaying matter, some type of decaying matter like bark or grass. The top of the cap is often viscid, which means sticky and wet. It could have a peelable pellicle. So it's a skin on top. Let me show you here. There is, over here is Psilocybe semilanceata. You can see that the top is shiny and sticky looking. It also can dry out like this and become kind of dry, but when it's wet, it becomes really sticky and translucent like that. And it also has a purple spore print. You're seeing here a purple spore print. So you cut the stem off, put the cap down on a piece of paper, let the spores dump, and then when they do, you look at the spore color. Is it brown? Is it white? Is it purple? Is it black? These are some of the main spore print. Pink that you can see out there. The spore print will always be purple. There will usually be bluing reaction, and the top of the cap, when it's wet, could be sticky, and it could have a peelable cap. Let's see if I show a picture here. Yeah, here's the peeling. Here's the cap that's peelable, or see how I'm picking up the top of the cap and stretching it up like that. So you get, it's called a pellicle. So some of them have that. Not all, but some of them have it. The gills are attached and have irregular lengths. However, other species also have that same thing, so don't count on that alone, but that's one characteristic it could have. The stems are often fairly slender, and there's not a big fat mushroom, in other words. The spore print purple gray to purple brown, sometimes a little darker. And you can actually see, if you look at the gills here, you can see the purple spores developing on the gills. The gills are actually starting to turn purple here. And this is Psilocybe semilanceata is the most abundant psychoactive mushroom on the coast of northern California to Alaska, along with cyanescens is also pretty common. Grows in very wet months or rotting sedge, grass with dungs around. Golden tops when dry. Here's a whole handful of them right here. Here's what they look like when they're growing. They're called liberty caps, so it kind of is like a bell type shape. Some years you get very massive fruitings, some none at all. And it contains up to maybe 1/4 to 2% psilocybin and psilocin. It also grows in Europe and very popular in Europe. So this is one of the most common species that you would find in the wild. This is Psilocybe pelliculosa, which grows in the wood, but it's a species that has very, very low amounts of psilocybin in it. Here is cyanescens. This is another very common one that's very, very potent. It's common on bark chips in gardens, landscaping. I've seen it growing in flower pots with bark chips, planter boxes, and often highly potent. It has a wavy cap. See how the cap is wavy here? And it's orange, tawny to buff is characteristic. So this, and a white stem. And here's this purple spore print. Here is the cap. Very, very easy to recognize. Here is a mass of it. In fact, this is my picture here, I think, growing in bark chips there. Now here's Psilocybe azurescens. This is a really potent species. This one is arguably the most potent species. Looks a little bit like cyanescens, but the cap is not so wavy like the other one is. They grow in clusters sometimes. So this is a really potent species if you happen to find it. We actually one time up on the Oregon coast in the public garden in the public vegetable garden, community vegetable garden, there were literally 400 or 500 psilocybe azurescens fruiting. So you can find very large amounts of it. There's some other species, Stuntzii, psilocybe stuntzii, Coprophylla, which is, the name has changed. It grows on dung, and the species one that is growing in Cruz, but it has very little psilocybin in it, if any. And a couple of others here, Cyanofibrillosa and so forth. David Aurora lists others in his Mushrooms Demystified, but the taxonomy is out of date. Now, Inocybe, again, here's what Inocybe looks like. It's kind of chunky, a little bit more chunky like that. The cap's a little irregular and wavy. Again, do not pick Inocybe. They contain muscarine, and maybe even when they have psilocybin, it isn't worth it. It can really make you sick. One characteristic I want to always point out with looking for psilocybins, if it has a brown spore print, do not use it, do not eat it. Not all brown spore printed mushrooms are toxic, but I would say more than likely it could be. So if it has a brown spore print, always take a spore print, do not use it, period. If it, so the Inocybe could have a ring on the stem, but you're not seeing it here. And it smells like green corn. It smells kind of like crushing green corn, the Inocybes. Here is a slide on muscarine, which Inocybe and Canocybe both contain, and also other mushroom genera, though psilocybin doesn't contain it in hardly any amounts at all. Muscarine is an alkaloid that's a strong parasympathomimetic. It activates the parasympathetic nervous system very strongly. It leads to symptoms like sweating, tearing up, slowing heartbeat, blurred vision, vomiting, abdominal pain within 2 hours of ingesting a mushroom that has muscarine in it, like in Inocybe, and occurs in Amanita, Clitocybe, Mycena, and Ptiloma. These are common mushroom genera, Omphaliotis and Inocybe, widespread. Oral lethal doses between 40 and 495 milligrams based on, so a single fruiting body can be lethal. That's the bottom line right there. You do not want to mess with Inocybe, Clitocybe, Amanita, and Ptiloma. Don't mess with them. A few are edible, but don't even mess with them. Other common lookalikes that could be dangerous, here is Galerina. You should know what this looks like if you're hunting wild mushrooms in general. Galerina marginalis grows typically on wood. Note there's a ring on the stem here. There's a little ring there and there and there. And kind of orange bell-shaped top. Grows in clusters sometimes. This one is potentially lethal. It has Amanita toxins in it. So any mushroom like that, of course, it has brown spores. So again, you're not going to touch anything that has brown spores. Somebody's microphone's on. Could you please mute? Stropharia ambigua is widely common, and that's not that toxic. Some reports it toxic. Okay, let's go on. We're kind of finished with psilocybin. Let's go on to Amanita muscaria, which is another visionary mushroom. Here is a picture of it. You know that, I'm sure you've seen it many times before. It's in the common lexicon of many cultures. It grows all over the world in most continents. It has considerable chemical variability between populations. So one might have one type of effect and another population might have another type. It's mycorrhizal with conifers. And what that means is mycorrhizal means that the fungi this is the fruiting body of the fungi here. Let me show you. Let me show you what I'm talking about here, mycorrhizal association. This is important. Amanita mycorrhizal. And we'll go to this one. Now, the mushroom consists of, this isn't as big as I'd like. I wonder if I can make it bigger. Hopefully you can see it. Any mushroom has these, I don't know why it's doing that. Let me see if I can get it. Well, any picture, or sorry, any mushroom that grows in the soil like this has, well, any higher fungi fruiting body is going to have mycelial threads coming out of the bottom here. So the mycelium, or the vegetative, you might say, portion of the fungi, Basidiomycetes, ascomycetes, that are growing in the soil. The spore germinates, produces mycelium, starts growing in the soil and the bark, whatever the substrate is, and it starts producing lots and lots of enzymes, very powerful enzymes that can break wood down, it can break leaf matter down, and it breaks organic matter into smaller molecules that the mushroom then, sugars and so forth, that the mushroom then can take up and use for nutrition. So this is kind of like the vegetative part of the fungi. And with mycorrhizal mushrooms like Amanita, what's happening is that you can see the mycelial threads here. They form very, very close relationships with tree roots. And here you can see how they contact the roots right here and penetrate the root cells even, or grow all around the cells. Let me see if I can get a better one. Oh, here, you can actually see it better over here. And here are the roots that are encasing the root hairs of the tree or the shrub. Here's another picture over here showing, see if I can find another one here. Here's Amanita muscaria patches growing. It isn't really showing the mycorrhizal too well. If I just go mycorrhizal, maybe it'll show us a better picture here. You can see here that there is a very important link between the fungus and the trees and shrubs and so forth. So basically all plants have mycorrhizal partners, fungal partners, and what happens is the mycelium breaks down organic matter, and it also helps with sequestering water and other nutrients, minerals, and so forth. And there's an intimate connection with the tree or the shrub or the plant. The mushroom supplies those types of things, and it also protects the tree roots from bacteria. So it protects the roots from being attacked by bacteria because the mushrooms produce antibiotics, as we know. They produce antibiotics like streptomycin and so forth. So the mushroom is providing a lot, but the tree and the shrub and the herb is providing the most important thing of all, and that's sugar. So the tree is using its chlorophyll to capture sunlight from 93 million miles away and produce sugar and store it in the form of sugar, all that sun energy, and the mushroom needs sugar. So the mushroom's getting sugar and maybe other things, but definitely this is a match made in heaven that is all over the planet, and it's so common. So anyway, that's a little bit of a sidebar about Amanita muscaria. It is a mycorrhizal species that grows in association with conifers. So you're always going to see it growing around conifers. Sometimes massive fruitings happen, sometimes, small fruitings. It has something to do, it's associated with the Santa Claus legend. I don't know why I've got claws here, I'll get rid of that. Let me go back to the full screen here, sorry. And get my picture back on the other screen, okay. And Gordon Wasson said that maybe Amanita muscaria is the ancient soma of the Rig Vedas of the ancient religion in Ayurveda. Here's the book that he wrote on it. They're beautiful mushrooms. They're fantastic. They just are. To see them up front, I hope you've had the opportunity to see them up front, up close and personal. They are really amazing organisms. Beautiful, gorgeous. So here are some of the characteristics. They have it. All amanitas have a universal veil. That it's a thin tissue, cottony tissue that covers the entire fungi. Do I have a picture here of it? Yes. Here is, you can see that this particular species of amanita has a universal veil of tissue that was covering the entire mushroom fruiting body, and it's kind of like an egg. And when the mushroom fruiting body expands, it starts breaking open this universal veil. Some of it sticks to the bottom like this one and creates what's called a volva. Here is one of the world's most deadliest mushrooms right here. This is Amanita phalloides. And you don't want to eat an amanita in that case. In this case, the bottom of the universal veil sticks to the bottom of the cap like this, but also part of the veil is this special ring here that covers and protects the gills where the spores are produced. And the rest of the universal veil dissolves as these spots here. As the tacky cap starts expanding and growing, then it leaves these little spots on the top. Here again is Amanita muscaria. Here's Amanita phalloides, which is deadly poisonous. Here's another Amanita, and here is an edible Amanita here. It has the skin top like that. This is Calyptoderma, which grows in California and is very, very delicious and edible. But again, don't try it until you know exactly what you're doing, because you could mistake this one for this one, or mistake this one for this one. And this one is deadly poison. This one's a delicious edible, and they're both from the genus Amanita. Here's another picture of phalloides. You can see how variable the cap is and how variable the stem is. They can be quite different. They have white spores. That's one characteristic. And they have the universal veil. Here's another. Now, sometimes you see a puffball that might be growing in the duff and you want to pick, like this one here, and you want to pick it and eat it, make sure that you cut it in half and make sure that it actually is a puffball. It's solid white and doesn't have this little outline of a mushroom inside. You don't want that because it could be, again, a deadly amanita. There's more Amanita phalloides. This one is one you do not want to mess with. However, the antidote to Amanita phalloides is the silymarin, which is a flavonolignin that's only found in the seed shell of milk thistle. And when you crush the seed shell or grind it up and tincture it in strong alcohol, you get this compound silibinin out of it and a few other related compounds collectively called silymarin. And this actually, if it used intravenously, because we don't absorb it very well, has saved lives that could have died because of Amanita phalloides poisoning. The range of Amanita muscaria is quite wide, as you can see. Grows all over the northern hemisphere and down in there. And now fly agaric and Santa Claus. I long like the idea that Santa Claus legend came from an Amanita muscaria cult of shamans that were using Amanita for visionary purposes, and then morphed into the Santa Claus legend, but it turns out that probably that's not true. However, here's a really old Christmas tree card, or sorry, Christmas card, where this shows that he's got Amanita in his bag here. There's the Amanita right there. So, you know, the interesting thing is that Santa Claus has a red and white costume. He goes ho ho ho, like you might after eating Amanita muscaria. And also, do reindeers fly? So, you know, there's some evidence, or there's some interesting facts that you could think right away. Well, you know, definitely Santa Claus legend arose from the shamanistic use in Lapland, maybe, of Amanita muscaria. It turns out it's probably not true, but there are many. If you can go online, you can see many cards, Christmas cards and so forth, with angels in Amanita and elves in Amanita and so forth. And a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, there's Amanita muscaria. Here's an old-fashioned card with Amanita muscaria for Christmas tree ornaments. And here is a picture that I found on the web showing a reindeer sniffing an Amanita. And do they really fly? Here's a real shaman, apparently, in Siberia that does Amanita muscaria ritual. So the shamanistic use of Amanita muscaria, though, is well known in Siberia. And in 1738, a researcher by the name of Strahlenberg basically went to Siberia and studied the ritual use of Amanita muscaria. And they say he reported that that many people lay up large provisions of fly agaric mushrooms for the winter. When they make a feast, they pour water upon some of the mushrooms and boil them. They drink the liquor, which intoxicates them. And so you can think of fly agaric as one of two ways. One is it's an intoxicant, and it has been and still is used as an intoxicant, maybe in Siberia, in northern Siberia, the far west of Siberia, far east of Siberia. And so they just use them for basically partying. They drink the liquor and it gets them really intoxicated, almost like alcohol. And the poorer people, this is the story. I can't imagine why it would be true, because anybody could pick Amanita muscaria if they could find them. The poorer people who cannot afford to lay in a store of these mushrooms post themselves on these occasions around the huts of the rich to catch the water, in other words, the urine, holding a wooden bowl to catch the urine, which they drink greedily. And that's because once you eat Amanita muscaria, supposedly the ibotenic acid and mucimol is what supposedly causes the psychedelic effects, is concentrated in the urine. And also, you don't get the side effects as much. So after drinking the urine of a user, you can actually get higher than the first time you eat them. This is widely known about Amanita muscaria. Here's some more about it. They eat certain fungi in the shape of fly agarics, and thus they get drunk worse than on vodka. And to them, it is the best banquet. So this has been reported from people in Siberia that and a number of people use Amanita muscaria. And sometimes for their enjoyment, they also use mucomor, the well-known mushroom that we ordinarily use for poisoning flies. Mucomor is another name for Amanita muscaria. And how they prepare it is they first soak it in fireweed tea. Here's the fireweed, Epilobium angustifolium. And they make a tea out of fireweed, and then they soak the mushrooms in the fireweed tea. So here's the symptoms that are reported from drunkenness from Amanita muscaria: shaking of the extremities after 30 to 60 minutes, hallucinations, And the visions can be terrifying or are happy, depending on the temperament of the person taking them. And again, set and setting, no doubt. Some jump, some dance, others cry out. However, these symptoms are usually from the overdose. Those that take a small quantity experience a feeling of extraordinary lightness, joy, courage, and a sense of energetic well-being. And here's a report from Sujikawa et al. 2006. Today, people in the far east of Russia still eat caps of Amanita muscaria recreationally and for working hard during the day. The cap has more mucimol and ibotenic acid in it than the stem. So the cap is usually eaten and you peel it because apparently most of the, if there's a little bit of muscarine in it, you peel the top off, the skin off, and that gets rid of some of it. Here is the, here are the symptoms of, did I mention this already? Let's see. Yeah, I already talked about that. Okay. So here's the kind of a timeline: ingestion, and then after 30 minutes, you start getting visual and auditive sensory changes, space and time distortion, and tearing up after 2 to 3 hours. And so this is when you get the hallucinations is up front in the first hour or two. Then after you start coming down, you feel tired, and you might get very drowsy and fall into a deep sleep and have very vivid dreams up to 8 hours later, and then finally complete recovery. Here are the signs and symptoms in more detail of ingestion. The first manifestations appear after about 30 minutes to 2 hours after mushroom consumption, and that depends on whether you have a full stomach. You could feel dizziness, difficulty in balance and movement, coordination, as well as tiredness that sometimes progresses into sleep, followed by psychomotor excitement with euphoria or depression and anxiety. We prefer the euphoria, of course. Visual and auditory hallucinations. Phases of tiredness and excitement may alternate several to many times. Increase in body temperature. The skin and mucous membranes are dry, the face is red, and the pupils are dilated. Got my pointer here. Now here's Amanita pantherina. Let me see. Yes, I'm at this one. Here's Amanita pantherina. This is a related species to Amanita muscaria. You can see that it has the ring here. It has the dots on the top, but instead of being red, it's kind of tawny brown or root beer brown kind of. Sometimes they can fade out into orange. You have to avoid this species because it is reported to contain a much higher concentration of muscarine than Amanita muscaria. However, they can intergrade kind of in color. Now, Amanita muscaria is also called fly agaric, and killing flies with fly agaric is still practiced in parts of Slovenia and other places. The mushroom fruiting body is ground up or crushed and added to milk to release its ibotenic acid. The flies become intoxicated and end up falling into the milk and dying. So that's why they call it fly agaric. And also edibility of Amanita muscaria. So David Aurora, who's a well-known author and expert in all things fungal, very well-known person. I met him. He lived in Santa Cruz for many years. That's where he's basically the one that got a lot of us going on mushrooms in Santa Cruz. And this was back in the late 70s. So here's an article that you can pick up where Aurora and Rubel talk about Amanita muscaria, how it's eaten in some cultures, and the history of the cultural uses of Amanita muscaria as food. So the mushroom caps are sliced and parboiled, like in this form here. The water, you can peel the skin off too. The water is drained 1 to 2 times. Then the leached slices are stir-fried in butter or olive oil, as you're seeing here. And no, there are no publications, according to these authors, no publications can be found that actually report on death from Amanita muscaria. So here is it eating it safely. Slice the mushroom cap, parboil for 5 to 10 minutes, drain. Second time is safer. Stir fry leech slices in olive oil, season with garlic, ginger, etc. Try 1 to 2 slices the first time, and then wait. Make sure it's okay overnight. Sporocarps are often very abundant. So here you're seeing the boiling of the slices, and here you're seeing the stir-fried results and somebody holding an Amanita fruiting body while they're eating the leached and fried slices. And they do, I will admit, they do have a very nice flavor and texture. A most interesting fungi for sure. So having said that, let's talk about reishi a bit here, but having said that about Amanita muscaria, I want to make sure to mention that I'm not recommending that you try it. I'm not recommending that you eat it. Results can vary, very definitely. One of the reviewers that reviewed my book said I was way too enthusiastic about Amanita muscaria. I've always been fascinated by it. I've always sought it, and I love looking at it and reading about it. And I just find it to be a very fascinating mushroom. And so he was criticizing me. I did end up making some changes in my text and downplay my enthusiasm for it. And so again, I'm not recommending you use it or try it. I'm simply talking about the historical effects and also the current uses for both eating it and safely, and also even using it as a visionary mushroom. It is still used, and it still is in the lore as well, and it does have a long history. But with those cautions, let's move on to reishi, the divine mushroom. And let's see, 14. So we're going, I guess, I think we're quitting at 5. So we're going another 15 minutes. We should just be able to get through reishi, and then we'll take questions or thereabouts. So reishi is also one of my all-time favorite fungi species. It's just a treasure of an organism. For one thing, it's so beautiful. It has this glossy, shiny cap. They come in many different forms. There are many different species. Reishi-like mushrooms. The genus is Ganoderma, and Ganoderma, see if I have a plot here, doesn't say it here. Ganoderma means shiny skin. So the whole genus of all the reishi-like mushrooms is Ganoderma. They occur all over the northern hemisphere. There are a number of species that are sold as reishi, as lingzhi. Lingzhi is the Chinese name of it. And it was first first mentioned in the Divine Husbandman or Farmer's Classic of the Materia Medica, the Shennong Pensao Jing from the 3rd century Common Era. And that's probably based on much earlier oral traditions. So it's known and has been revered as a healing mushroom and as a visionary mushroom, really, as it's considered a spirit mushroom. In ancient medicine, they thought that it calmed the spirit. and augmented the heart qi and had many other uses. Here's this is the Pen Sao or Ben Sao Gong Mu from 1578, the most extensive herbal of Chinese herbal medicine, and very renowned. And in the Ben Sao Gong Mu, they talk about six different types of reishi, and they're all different colors. And they come from a category of herbs known as herbs for the immortals, and which are thought to be rare in the secular world. And I thought this was great. And this is the quote directly from the Pen Sao. And they say, generally speaking, when one gets a hold of Ganoderma, one would like to eat it right away without hesitation. So there is no such thing as the method of use. In other words, boiling it or tincturing it or whatever, they would just eat it. And they also say that Ganoderma grows where there is harmony in the earth. So in the eastern United States, there are 3 or 4 pretty common reishi-like mushrooms. There's Ganoderma resinaceum, of course, Ganoderma sugi grows back there, and a few others, Ganoderma curtisii. So there are 3 or 4 well-known that look like reishi that can be used very similarly, if not exactly the same as reishi. And this is back in the East Coast. In Europe, there is Ganoderma lucidum and a few other species that are used. On the West Coast, there we have at least 2. We have Ganoderma oregonense, which I'll show you a picture of coming up. We also have Ganoderma sugi, T-S-U-G-A-E. And Ganoderma sugi grows on hemlocks. And here you're seeing a Ganoderma sugi growing on hemlocks in North Carolina. Beautiful, beautiful mushroom, just unbelievable, otherworldly. And you can see why, if you consider doctrine of signatures, you can see why it was so revered, because it just blows you away when you really see one like that. Now, again, I mentioned there are different colors of reishi. The ones that I use the most are the red rishis. Red reishi, most of the ones out there in the marketplace are red reishi. And she has beneficial effects for the heart and cardiovascular system, and also on the nervous system. So those are the 2 that I mainly use. The black one supposedly supports the kidneys and is a yin tonic, whereas there are other colored ones as well, but I don't find those very often. So I mainly deal with the red ones or the black ones. Now here are some more instructions on how to use reishi. On a day when everything is in harmony, cut the herb with a knife made of bone and dry the herb in the shade. They're talking about Ganoderma, one of the Ganodermas, probably Ganoderma lingzhur, which is the traditional one. Take the drug. In this way, it works effectively. And then again, if one is not wholeheartedly devoted and abstaining from meat and wine for a long time with condemned deeds, oh God, I can think of a few people with condemned deeds, but hopefully not myself or any of you, and bad virtue, and does not know the special way of entering the mountain, he will not get the drug, even he has an illustration of it. So in other words, they know what it looks like, but they're not going to find it if they have evil intentions or bad virtue. So again, the theme of it's a spiritual mushroom that only reveals itself when your heart is pure, if you will. The spirit will not lend a helping hand if you are not pure of heart and have good intentions. Now, this is very characteristic, isn't it, of shamanism. When I went to Peru and did ayahuasca ceremony with some other herbalists years ago, the shaman told us that he had to go through many, many years, at least 5 years, of not only taking ayahuasca, but also abstaining from sex and eating a very strict diet. Of course, one always wonders whether he was able to do that or not. But anyway, he was a very, very incredible shaman. I'll grant you that. His chants were amazing, and his insights were amazing. He was a really great guide. And they also say that long-term use of the drug makes one feel happy and vigorous and enjoy a long life like an immortal. Now we go, I'll show you a picture of the ones that we pick. Now there are several different species of reishi-like mushrooms that you can find in Chinese herb shops, including this one and these ones with this one doesn't. This is Cecily. This is Ganoderma Cecily here, and it has no stalk. And then you have the black one, and then you have these, and then you have this one. This is Ganoderma Lingzhi, or the ancient reishi right here. And then they also come in slices. Companies slice them up into thin slices so that you can brew them more easily. Ganoderma Lingzhi or lucidum. This is, if you read about reishi, it'll probably say Ganoderma lucidum. Well, this is incorrect. Ganoderma lucidum is not reishi, considered reishi anymore. It's one of the reishi-like mushrooms, but it is not. Reishi is not strictly Ganoderma lucidum, which mainly grows in Europe. And the name change now of the traditional Asian reishi is going to be Ganoderma Lingzhi, which I'll show you in a minute. Well, right here, you're seeing it. Ganoderma Lingzhi is considered the traditionally used reishi or Lingzhi in Asia. Or secondarily, Ganoderma sichuanense could also have been used. One of those two, but the ones that I like are Ganoderma Lingzhi. And I have done the molecular work. I extracted DNA from the mushroom, and the one here that I'm showing you, this one, I extracted DNA and tested it, and according to the international database of GenBank, it did turn out to be Ganoderma Lingzhi. So this came from, this is Ganoderma Lingzhi here. The powder has been rubbed off, and this is Ganoderma lucidum at the bottom here. Doesn't really look as much like it. Again, they're celebrated in art. Here's a more antler form here. When the carbon dioxide levels change, it won't produce a cap. It'll produce, or monoxide, it'll produce this straight one. And here's the spore producing surface right here and right here. I took these pictures in the Amazon on some cut ancient trees that were cut and put down as stepping stones because the bottom in the jungle, the rainforest, it often flooded. So they put these big rounds down, and coming out of those were all these reishi-like mushrooms. Now, reishi has all kinds of biological effects and that have been shown, that have been proven, including pain relieving, anti-allergy, antihistamine, anti-inflammatory, bacterial, antioxidant, anti-tumor and anti-mutagenic, antiviral, antihypertensive, so it can help regulate blood pressure. Many different aspects of immunomodulation and immunostimulating has been demonstrated, enhancing bone marrow production of new white blood cells. So that's pretty profound. And maybe one reason why it was considered a sacred mushroom, because it really literally can become restorative to the immune system. Enhance natural killer cell activity to help fight pathogens in cancer cells, and interleukin 1 and 2, which mediates inflammation and other aspects of the body's physiology. increase in white blood cell production. Now, this is really important for people on chemotherapy or people who have immunosuppression. And for my mind and my experience, Ganoderma lingere or reishi, like mushroom, can be crucial and very important for helping to support immune function if there is immune suppression of any kind, including during chemotherapy. It also known to be cardiotonic, antithrombotic, so it helps reduce the possibility of abnormal clotting. Some people have said don't use it during before or after a surgery, but of course there hasn't been any evidence that it would lead to abnormal bleeding. But if you want to, go ahead and avoid it before and after surgery. It has a calming effect on the central nervous system and the cholinergic system. It has expectorating and antitussive, anti-cough effects. It can support the adrenal cortical functions if we're under stress, so you can consider it an adaptogen. Protects against ionizing radiation if you're exposed to, if you're flying a lot, that can be a problem because you're going to be exposed to a lot more ionizing radiation if you're in a plane a lot. And anti-ulcer. Now here are the traditional indications and dose. Calms the spirit, first and foremost. Augments the heart chi and tonifies the heart blood for insomnia, fright and palpitations and forgetfulness associated with insufficient heart chi and blood. So this has been my experience with it. I have found it over the years to be just such an amazing remedy, right in my top 5. If someone pushed me hard enough, well, what are your top 5 favorite herbs? I'm sure that reishi would be among them. I have had such great effects personally. I use it every day during the time that we're sheltering right now. I'm using reishi extract powder every day. I put it in my tea and I use it every day. And I find that it's not only calming, but also I'm really convinced, and this is based on years of experience, using it for colds and flus to help protect myself against coming down with a cold or flu in the first place. I found it to be incredibly effective. And failing to nourish the spirit, the blood failing to nourish the spirit, where you feel spiritual ennui perhaps, or a depression that you really don't know where it came from. You might say spiritual lethargy. Then reishi can be used as a standalone herb for this purpose. Deficiency consumption, cough, wheezing, insomnia, and poor digestion. And this comes right out of Bensky et al., Chinese Materia Medica, which is an indispensable book for any herbalist to have on their shelf at hand, is the Bensky and Barrelet book. Well, just Bensky. I guess the Barrelet was in on the formulary. But this is there are 2 books from Bensky et al., Chinese Materia Medica. There's the herbal, and then there's the formulary. So you want the herbal definitely, and have it on your shelf because it describes a lot of Western herbs, how they're used clinically, side effects, and benefits, and dose. So including reishi. Traditional indications and dose, again, it's considered sweet and neutral. It enters the heart, liver, and lung channel. Again, heart has to do with the nervous system as well, and then the lung for respiratory conditions of all kind. Calms the spirit while augmenting the chi and nourishing the blood. Dosage is 3 to 15 grams in decoction, 1.5 to 3 grams in pills and powders. If you take a steamed or heated powder that's finely powdered, you can just mix that into hot water and take it. That's the way I use it. And again, Mushroom Harvest makes some great powders. I work with them closely. And used with caution in patients with excessive conditions. Clinical indications for anti-aging. It's like if someone is aging too fast, a powerful antioxidant. Adjuvant for cancer treatment protocols. I certainly would be using it. Nervous system disorders, neurasthenia, dizziness, insomnia, deficiency types of, especially in deficiency types of insomnia, and spirit or Shen disturbance. Mental diseases, Alzheimer, respiratory tract conditions like especially chronic rhinitis, bronchitis, other upper respiratory tract infections, respiratory allergies, duodenal ulcers, regulates blood lipids in a mild way. It's not a drug, remember. Can help regulate insulin circuitry, again, not as a drug. And it can help support liver function for people who might have hepatitis. Here is Ganoderma sugi. This is the most beautiful mushroom I've ever seen. This one was a 17-pound reishi-like mushroom growing on hemlock in the High Sierra. It's called the Ganoderma sugi on the West Coast. It's called Song Shan Lingzhi, and it's the pine tree fungus. It's the pine tree lingzhi or reishi. Widely cultivated in Taiwan, closely related to the traditional reishi or lingzhi, which you can use instead of the traditional one. Here is a picture I took in North Carolina on a dying hemlock. It's the most beautiful mushroom ever, it really is. And I had wonderful effects from this wild reishi that grows on the East Coast, Ganoderma sugi. And unfortunately, I don't think I have a picture. I wish I had a picture of the West Coast. We pick Ganoderma sugi that looks a little different than this. In the High Sierra, it also grows up in Oregon in the High Cascades, but only on hemlock trees that are old hemlock trees. That's what it grows on. And if you can find one, you can actually eat the outer portion of the mushroom, like in this one. This is one here. This is an older picture, but you can, this part right here, the young tender part, you can actually eat that like the ancients did, and I did. I ate it as the ancients did. I took bites of this and ate it, and it's really quite amazing and sweet and mild and very soft. Whereas once it starts to mature here, then you cannot eat these anymore. These are incredibly high in fiber. So you don't want to eat a whole lot of this because it's still got a lot of fiber in it. But you can eat several bites of it, which I do when I find them fresh. And or you can take the whole fruiting body and you can slice it up and you can make a dried tea powder, which I will describe in detail in my book. Also on my website, there's a handout how to make mushroom powders at home. And so I go through the whole process, and there's a handout on my website. Okay, so if you are buying products like a reishi product, like a bottle of reishi capsules, how do you know that it doesn't have a bunch of starch in it? I mean, a little starch is inevitable if you're growing on grains, even if you let it go for a long time, but you don't want very much starch. What you want is mostly mushroom fruiting body or mycelium, one or the other. One's not any better than the other, but it just should be the mushroom biomass. That's the main point. So to test your own product, you get a bottle of iodine solution. In this case, I bought one from Amazon. You go ahead and take your capsules and open up 2 or 3 capsules, or if it's a powder in a bag, you take a half a teaspoon and you stir it in the water and you get an amber kind of a liquid like this. And then you go ahead and put your iodine solution in. Now, maybe a dropper full or half a dropper full is enough. So if it turns bright, bright blue like this, then you know that you have a lot of starch in here because that's the starch test. Iodine binds into the starch is in the form of a helix coil, and iodine fits into that coil, and then it reflects back blue light. So this is the classic starch test. You don't want it to turn dark and bright blue and stay dark and bright blue. You don't want that. That's going to mean a lot of starch. And if it turns purple instead of blue, you can see this liquid is purple. Then you have glycogen, which is the way that mushrooms store glucose. So when they're feeding on rice or something, a good source of starch and glucose, they break it down to get the glucose, and then they need a lot of glucose to fruit. They need a lot of energy to produce a fruiting body. So they end up storing it as glycogen, similar to animals. I mentioned that animals and fungi have some things in common. This is one of the things. Mushrooms produce glycogen and storage. So if it has a lot of glycogen in the product, that's going to be better than starch, but it's still not completely ideal, because mushroom glycogen is going to have a little bit of immune stimulating or activating activity, but certainly not as much as beta-glucan. So you don't want too much. A little bit's okay of glycogen. Like I said, it does have a little bit of immunomodulating activity. Okay, then there's that. Okay, so that's about it. And now let's take some questions if there are any.
Oh, there's questions. Okay. Do you have a particular brand of reishi that you prefer to use? I know you were just talking about it with control issues, but do you have any direct recommendations? And if you do have them and made them and I missed them, I apologize.
Well, as I mentioned, Mushroom Harvest is who I work most closely with. There are good manufacturers out there. There are some manufacturers that I don't think a whole lot of, because I think their products have a lot of starch in them. And I've tested them personally for beta-glucans, so I can't say much for those. I'm not going to mention any of the brands that I don't think much of. But what I am going to say is that I think a few brands are good out there that I know of. But what I can also say is that I work closely with George at Mushroom Harvest. And so that's my main recommendation for mushroom powders, because he not only has got his, he's very ethical person and tries to do the best job he can. He also grows completely organic, and also produces the mushrooms in the US, in northern Washington, in a beautiful area that's very pristine. And I think that he has some major advantages. Also, I know how he produces and how he processes the mushrooms, and I think that's a really good way that he's doing it. And I personally tested a lot of his species. I know that he's using the right species. And I also know that his beta-glucan content is there. He actually is guaranteeing beta-glucan content as much as just about anybody in the marketplace. There are other brands that are good. I'm not going to mention all of them. You just have to do some research on it. But I can definitely wholeheartedly recommend Mushroom Harvest. And you can order powders from their website.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Could you speak a little bit about using reishi with autoimmune diseases?
Yes. I mean, any mushroom that is considered an immune stimulant, you might think, well, if a person has an overactive immune system, then should I use medicinal mushrooms that are going to activate different aspects of my immune response? And that is a very common question that I've gotten over the years. It turns out that what we think, the latest research on autoimmune conditions, and I'm not saying that this is every case, but many researchers now are feeling like, and there's more evidence to back it up, that autoimmune conditions respond to a viral infection. Now, we have a number of viruses in our body that are resident. So we have Epstein-Barr, we have probably 80–90% of the population has some kind of herpes virus. So viruses are inside of our body just as bacteria and fungi are. So it's thought now that many autoimmune conditions like Crohn's disease, chronic asthma, and so forth may be due to a viral infection. If it's some other purpose, why is our body attacking our own cells and causing abnormal amounts of inflammation? In my experience and throughout the literature, I'm really feeling these days that medicinal mushrooms like reishi, like turkey tails, and so forth, really are more immunomodulatory than they are immune stimulating. Yes, they stimulate certain aspects of the immune system, but in the most, I really feel like it's going to help people that have autoimmune conditions. And again, in my practice, I've never seen anybody with an autoimmune condition have a really untoward effect after taking medicinal mushrooms. So there isn't a whole lot of research on it, the use of medicinal mushrooms with autoimmune conditions, but the small amount of research that I have seen has indicated that it shouldn't be a problem. And so typically I recommend starting people with autoimmune conditions. I typically recommend starting with a low dose, which is of the powder, the processed powder is going to be about maybe a gram, which is 2 double-aught caps, or about 1/4 teaspoon. I'd start with that, twice a day, and then work my way up to maybe for more serious illnesses, and for prevention, it might be 2 or 3 grams a day, which would be a teaspoon a day. And then if you have an illness that you're working with, then I would up it. I would double that. I would even take 2 teaspoons a day of the powder. So that's what I have to say about that.
Thank you. A student has a question about your methodology for preparing reishi at home. They use the dried mushroom chopped up, and they prepare it half as a water extract, boiled slowly. Then they strain it and add half of like an equal amount of alcohol to then soak for 6 weeks. They read that this is the best way to tincture reishi. Do you agree with this, or do you have another method?
Yes, that's called a double extraction, and that is a good way to extract reishi at home. There are 2 ways to extract reishi and other medicinal mushrooms, but especially reishi, because reishi has not only the beta-glucans, which are sugar polymers, which are not soluble in alcohol, zero solubility in alcohol, but they also contain terpenes like triterpenes, which are very, very well known to be at a high level in Ganoderma species, reishi-like mushrooms. They're very well known to be a high concentration of triterpenes in there. And these have all kinds of beneficial effects as well. They're anti-inflammatory. They have effects on the nervous system, and many beneficial effects. So if you want to capture both the triterpenes, which are mainly alcohol soluble, they can also be soluble in hot water though. And you want to capture the beta-glucans, which are not alcohol soluble, then you have to do a double extraction. And to do that, as mentioned, you boil the mushroom first, chop it up with a pair of shears, grind it up, we'll cook it a bit or soak it until it's soggy, and then blend it up with water, then cook it for 2 to 3 hours. You can use a pressure cooker, and I think a pressure cooker is even better because the higher you heat it, the more you break the chitin beta-glucan bond, and then it makes the beta-glucans more bioavailable and water soluble. So this is going to have higher immunological activity. So if you have a pressure cooker, use that for maybe say half an hour to an hour on high, set on high, and you're going to get more of the goodies out of the cell walls, which are all active. And then you basically blend that up with the cooking water and pour it into a food dehydrator, the fruit leather trays, and dry it and then powder it. And so that's the way to make a powdered tea powder, a dried tea powder. I describe that in great detail in my book, dried tea powder. I like that a lot because it really captures pretty much everything in there. Now, if you liquid, it's easier, less processing, I guess. So you boil the mushroom like I described for making the dried tea, and then once it cools down, you are going to add as much alcohol as there is water in there. That's one way to do it, and just grind, blend it again, and then let it sit for a week or two, and then you're going to pull out a lot of the you're going to pull out some more of the triterpenes. You do get some of the triterpenes with boiling and processing that way, and if you're using the whole fruiting body, as I've described in the tea extract, you're going to get everything anyway. So that's why it's my favorite way of processing it. But if you want a liquid, then yes, you can either do it one of two ways. You can make the tea as I described, blend it up after it cools, add 50%, add alcohol, just as much alcohol as there is water, and then blend it again to mix it all up, and then let it steep for 2 weeks and press it out, press the liquid out, and you have a double extraction, which is going to have some beta glucans and it's going to have some triterpenes. And then take a teaspoon at a time. And the other way to do it would be to make the tea, make a really strong tea, and blend it up like I mentioned. Press the liquid out, press the tea out in this version, and then you take the dried marc left over, and then you tincture that in strong alcohol. Then once you've tinctured that out over, say, 10 days, just the marc, then you press that out again. Then you have a tincture of the marc, and you have the boiled down tea. And what I would do is I would recommend boiling the tea down even more. Once you press the tea out of the fruiting body, simmer it down till it's about 1/10 of the original volume. So it's a very concentrated tea. Then you're going to blend the tea together with the tincture that you make, and you're going to have a very good double extraction. So hope that wasn't too complicated. It's all described again in my book.
Thank you. Speaking of your book, a student asked if your book is available for pre-order somewhere.
No, not yet. It may be available for, I'm hoping, I don't know what the publisher is going to do. I'm hoping that it'll be available for pre-order, but it's definitely not going to be until the fall. Nothing's going to be available till the fall.
Okay, thank you very much. Michael Tierra has a few questions. He wants to know how long the mushroom powders remain therapeutically effective.
Years. They're very stable. If stored in a place where there isn't a lot of heat and light, then it should be very stable for years.
Wonderful. Michael also asks if you could, he said that Subhuti Dharmananda said that the way that reishi works is that the body recognizes it as a foreign body and its efforts to clear that foreign body, and thus the immune system is activated. He doesn't know what to think of this, but he's interested in how reishi is broken down and utilized, and was wondering if you had any comments about that.
Well, I can show you here. I think that's simplistic and not really very accurate. Nowadays, we really know very, very well how mushrooms work on the immune system. We know it's really worked out very, very well. Let me show you here. I'll open up my medicinal mushroom PowerPoint. Oh gosh, forgot about that. I hope I don't forget the. I created one that had a password. Okay, good. Now this shows you what happens here are the beta glucans. They're in the form of a triple helix. Here's the cross section of the cell wall. And here are the beta glucans. Here's the chitin, and there's some other molecules in here. But the beta glucans particularly, they're highly branched and they're very large. 1613 or 1316 delta beta glucans. They're in the triple helix form like this too. These are the most powerful immunological activators that we know about in herbs, in the herbal kingdom, or certainly even drugs. I mean, even doctors are prescribing beta glucans now for immune suppression. And so what happens is, here's a blow up. I'll have this one. So when the beta glucan and the mushroom fragments, here are pieces of beta glucans, here are pieces of mushroom right here, travel down the gut, macrophages are in the gut tissue, especially in the Peyer's patches and immune tissue that's in the gut. And so when we eat, say we blended up some reishi and we cooked it and we ate it, these beta glucan pieces are going to be going down in our gut. And the macrophages are over many millennia, millions of years probably, animals have learned to recognize a fungal material, a fungal cell wall, because they're potential pathogens. And so these pieces actually bind to the beta glucans, actually bind to receptor sites on the macrophage that are in our gut called dectin and toll-like receptor. And then they migrate inside the macrophage, which is one of our big immune cells. They get digested and broken down and primed, and then the macrophage sheds the beta glucan fragments that have been processed. And these bind to granulocytes, which are another big type of immune cell that are very important. And then these granulocytes that have been activated. So you think about these granulocytes as being activated by these pieces of beta glucan. So these are activated, and these are bad immune cells. They will go after tumor cells. They'll go after pathogens like bacteria or viruses. And once they're activated, they are super killers of tumor cells, viruses, and bacteria. So this is only one way that we know of that they work, but this is one of the major ways in which beta glucans work, and beta glucans are very, very rich in the cell walls of all mushrooms.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. There's a couple of questions about lion's mane. If you have time, the student would like to know, what's your favorite extraction or preparation method for lion's mane?
Well, I think lion's mane has diterpenes in it, which has beta glucans, but even more important, it has diterpenes in them. And these diterpenes are very potent, have very potent neurogenic effects. So they've been shown to stimulate the growth of new nerve tissue, maybe for repair and so forth. They also have effects on our mood. So they're being used in clinical trials for depression and mood disorders. So they become very, very popular. And they are an edible too, by the way, and a delicious edible if you can find one in the wild. And you can buy them from a mushroom grower, like maybe Far West Fungi grows fruiting bodies that you can buy. If you're in the Bay Area, you can buy lion's mane fruiting bodies from Berkeley Bowl or Monterey Market, and they are quite delicious. Sometimes you can find them in the wild if you're lucky and know where to look. But so they have these diterpenes that are very important for the beneficial effects. Also beta glucans, there are also phenolics in there, and so forth. So the best preparations, or you can either eat them, that's a good preparation, ground up and cooked well, putting them in soup, slice them up, stir frying. So that's one way to get the benefits. Another way is to you know, if someone's growing the mycelium and also guaranteeing that it's mostly mycelium and not too much starch, then you can get a high content of the diterpenes. And so those are basically just heated and broken down by heat, maybe steamed, and then ground up to a powder and put into either bags, or which you can take a half teaspoon or a teaspoon at a time, or so anyway, you can use them as a powder or in capsules. Now, finally, you can make a tincture. The diterpenes are alcohol soluble. Again, you're not going to get much of the beta glucans with a tincture. You could try a double extraction, but I think if you wanted the mood effects or the neurogenic effects, what you would do would you would slice the fruiting body, or if you could get mycelium, but you know, you can buy the fruiting body from a grower, and so you just slice it and you dry it, and then you grind it up in alcohol, about 80% ethanol and about 20% water, and then you'd make the strongest tincture that you could make by stuffing a lot of that powdered fruiting body into the alcohol, and in that way you're going to get some of the diterpenes out, and then you can take that as an extract, half a teaspoon to a teaspoon at a time.
Thank you so much. There were a couple of questions regarding reishi and contraindications, such as using reishi in pregnancy. How do you feel about safety and efficacy with regards to reishi in pregnancy, or just I think we talked a little bit earlier about in general. But if you could speak a little bit about, I guess, specifically reishi and its use in pregnancy, that would be wonderful.
I don't think of any contraindications for reishi in pregnancy, though, again, the most important book for contraindications would be the Botanical Safety Handbook. And I think they should have reishi in here. But as far as I'm concerned, there really aren't any, unless the mom has bleeding problems, maybe. Maybe there are bleeding problems going on, and maybe right around the birth, you might think about being more introspective about it. 387, yes, it's in the Botanical Safety Handbook. Let me tell you what they say about it in the Botanical Safety Handbook. What they say is that it has no interactions, it has no contraindications, no other precautions. And let's see what they say about pregnancy. No information on the safety of reishi in pregnancy or lactation was identified in the scientific or traditional literature. So as far as we know, there are no contraindications during pregnancy and lactation. And I've never really come across any myself either.
Thank you. Students were hoping that you could re-show the slide with the book list again. You showed it very, very early on at the beginning of the presentation.
You mean the mushroom?
Yes. And then speaking of books and mushrooms, Michael said that he believes that the first monograph of any herb was on reishi. Legend was that the emperors were looking for an herb of immortality. They sent out monks in different directions. They could not find a botanical that bestowed immortality, but the closest was reishi, and thus the first monographs were created. He was hoping for your corroboration on that story.
I would not deny that at all. I agree with it.
Great. I think that sums up all of the questions from the group. There were general questions about mushroom identification and safety. If you wanted to talk about that a little bit in terms of, ensuring that you're not identifying a poisonous mushroom instead of an edible or medicinal one. There were quite a few questions about that.
Well, there's no easy answer. Again, like you sometimes read about, you put a silver coin with it, and if it turns black, you don't eat it. Or if you see that an animal has taken bites out of a mushroom in the wild, that it's okay to eat. Could be a slug. They don't have livers, for one thing. And so there are other folk stories like that about what mushrooms are edible and which are not. And the bottom line is, you have to know what you're doing. You have to know what the mushrooms are. You have to be able to use more than one characteristic to identify the mushroom. So you want to take a spore print. You want to look at the stem, at how thick it is, how fat it is, the shape of the cap, the color, maybe the taste or smell, and so forth. So you want to look it over very carefully and take all the information in. There are many good guides out there. Do I hold on one second and I'll show you my favorite guide here. There are many. There's let's see, I'm going to grab a few of the ones that I use. Depends on where you live. I don't think I have. Here's David Aurora. If you're really interested in hunting wild mushrooms, I recommend getting a used copy of Mushrooms Demystified, because it really will get you jazzed up on mushrooms. It'll get you all excited because his sense of humor is so great. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful book. And it still has the best descriptions of mushrooms in any book, and the most detailed. The taxonomy is out of date, but it's still a very valuable resource. And then if you're in California, you're going to get California mushrooms. And so you have to have a good guide. That's my point. You have to have a good guide. And these types of guides, they talk about lookalikes. They'll talk about the characteristics of the mushroom, the spore color, the size of the cap, the size of the stem, on and on, where it grows, what elevation, and then they'll talk about lookalikes. So if you want to get a good guide for your area, there is a good guide for the Eastern United States. There's a good guide for different areas of Canada. There's the mushrooms of the Redwood Coast. If you live along the coast anywhere, that is a fantastic book. Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast, if you live in coastal California or Oregon. So get a local guide, study it, look at your mushrooms. If you can, go out for a hike with somebody that really knows what they're doing, and don't take any chances. Like I said, there's some really toxic ones out there. We have a saying: there are old mushroom hunters and there are bold mushroom hunters, but there are no old bold mushroom hunters. And I'm still here, and I've been hunting mushrooms since 1977 and eating them, and I eat 50 species wild at least. So I'm very cautious. I always have been.
I'm
Thank
so
you
glad,
so
Christopher,
much.
that you're an old mushroom hunter, not an old one.
Well, I don't know about that, but I guess I am. I don't know. But I am bold in some ways, but not when it comes to eating mushrooms.
Oh,
Thank you so much, Christopher. This was wonderful.
My pleasure.
Christopher,
Yeah.
we're always so honored to have you as a guest speaker with the East West School, and I'm also really treasure our friendship.
Me too, Michael. I love you a lot, as you know, and Leslie too.
me too,
And
Chris.
always honored to speak, and thanks for having me.
It's a real gift for us. Thank you so much. And I actually have a gift for everyone. Maybe you already have seen this, but there's that movie, Fantastic Fungi. And I have a link I can share, and I'm going to send it out to everybody as a gift. Have you seen it, Chris?
Not yet.
Oh, well, then I'll put you on the list.
Yeah, it's a beautiful
Okay.
book, a beautiful, beautiful film.
Yeah, that's what I've heard.
Yeah.
Gorgeous visually, yeah, so look for that. All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Pamela. You're a wonderful moderator.
Thank you, Pamela.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Oh,
Pamela.
gosh. I can hardly wait till COVID is over and we can see you again, Chris.
And thanks for all the participants for coming and partaking.
Yes,
Well,
absolutely.
we had a large group of them in attendance today, but a lot of them will see it later also as well. So again, you're a real treasure. Thanks.
Yes.
See you later. Bye.
Bye, be well, everyone.
Okay, be well.
Be well.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.